The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old congresswoman from Texas, stood facing former President Barack Obama at a private Democratic leadership gathering. What started as a routine discussion about party strategy had just taken a dramatic turn that no one saw coming. Obama, with his trademark measured tone, had just delivered what many in the room considered a devastating critique. "Representative Crockett, I appreciate your passion, but I have to question whether you have the experience necessary to lead on these complex issues." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to being challenged by the most respected voice in the Democratic Party. Obama's words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at high noon. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes locked on Obama's, and what happened next would send shockwaves through the Democratic establishment and change how everyone viewed this rising political star. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these jaw-dropping political moments that are reshaping America. This confrontation is about to get intense, and you won't believe how it ends. The former president sat back in his chair, confident that his decades of political experience had just put this young congresswoman in her place. He had no idea that Crockett was about to deliver a response that would leave him speechless and force him to completely reconsider everything he thought he knew about her capabilities. This wasn't just a disagreement between party members. This was about to become a defining moment that would show the nation what real political courage looks like when experience meets determination. The luxury resort setting, with its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers, seemed almost too elegant for the political battle that was about to unfold. Obama had arrived at this exclusive Democratic leadership retreat with his usual confidence, knowing that his presence alone commanded respect from every person in attendance. The gathering brought together senators, congressmen, governors, and party strategists, all seeking wisdom from the man who had transformed American politics during his 8 years in the White House. For weeks leading up to this moment, tensions had been building within the Democratic Party about the direction of progressive politics. Younger members like Crockett had been pushing for more aggressive approaches on issues like criminal justice reform, voting rights, and economic inequality. Meanwhile, establishment figures preferred more moderate, traditional strategies that emphasized compromise and incremental progress. Crockett had been invited to present her comprehensive criminal justice reform proposal to this elite group of party leaders. She had spent months crafting legislation that she believed could fundamentally transform America's approach to law enforcement, sentencing, and rehabilitation. Her passion for these issues was evident in every word she spoke, every statistic she cited, and every personal story she shared. But Obama had been listening with growing skepticism. Her proposals for sweeping changes to the justice system, aggressive voting rights legislation, and bold economic reforms struck him as naive and politically unrealistic. He had seen countless young politicians come and go, full of fire and idealism, but lacking the practical experience to navigate the complex realities of governance. As Crockett concluded her presentation, Obama felt compelled to offer what he considered constructive criticism. In his mind, he was doing her a favor by sharing the wisdom that came from his years of experience at the highest levels of American politics. He genuinely believed that tempering her expectations and helping her understand political realities would make her more effective in the long run. The other attendees in the room represented a cross-section of Democratic power. There were senators who had served for decades, congressmen who had built their careers on careful coalition building, and party strategists who understood the delicate balance required to win elections while advancing progressive causes. Most of them shared Obama's skepticism about Crockett's ambitious proposals. What none of them fully understood was the depth of experience that Crockett brought to these issues. Her background wasn't just academic or theoretical. It was forged in the trenches of America's criminal justice system, where she had witnessed firsthand the human cost of the policies they were discussing in this comfortable resort setting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge fundamental assumptions about experience, expertise, and the qualifications necessary to lead on complex social issues. Obama represented the establishment approach to politics, with its emphasis on pragmatism, incremental progress, and working within existing systems. Crockett represented a newer generation of leaders who believed that urgent problems required bold solutions, even if those solutions challenged comfortable assumptions about how politics should work. Neither of them realized that this moment would become a turning point, not just in their own relationship, but in how the Democratic Party thought about experience, qualification, and the value of different types of expertise in political leadership. The exclusive Democratic leadership retreat was taking place at a luxury resort nestled in the mountains outside Washington, far from the prying eyes of media and the distractions of daily political combat. The setting was deliberately chosen to encourage frank discussions among party leaders about strategy, policy, and the future direction of Democratic politics in America. Barack Obama entered this environment as the undisputed elder statesman of the Democratic Party. Despite no longer holding office, he remained the party's most powerful voice, and his opinions carried enormous weight with donors, activists, and elected officials alike. His 2 terms as president had established him as one of the most successful politicians of his generation, someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of Washington politics while maintaining broad public support and achieving significant legislative victories. Obama's approach to politics had always emphasized pragmatism over idealism. He believed in the power of incremental progress, careful coalition building, and finding common ground even with political opponents. This philosophy had served him well during his presidency, allowing him to pass major legislation like health care reform, despite fierce Republican opposition, and navigate international crises with steady leadership. His skepticism toward Crockett's proposals wasn't born of malice or disrespect, but from his deep understanding of how difficult it was to achieve meaningful change within America's political system. He had entered the presidency with his own ambitious agenda for transforming American politics, only to discover that the realities of governing required constant compromise and adjustment of expectations. From Obama's perspective, Crockett represented a familiar type in Democratic politics. The passionate young idealist who hadn't yet learned the hard lessons that came with actual governing responsibility. He had seen numerous politicians follow this pattern, entering office with grand plans for revolutionary change, only to become frustrated and ineffective when they discovered that the political system was more resistant to transformation than they had anticipated. What Obama didn't fully appreciate was the unique background that Jasmine Crockett brought to this discussion. Born and raised in St. Louis, she had grown up in a working-class family that struggled with many of the economic challenges that would later shape her political priorities. Her path to politics had been anything but conventional or easy. After graduating from law school with substantial student debt, Crockett had faced a choice that would define her career. She could have joined a prestigious corporate law firm, focusing on lucrative commercial litigation that would have quickly paid off her loans and established her financial security. Instead, she chose to become a public defender, representing clients who couldn't afford quality legal representation in a system that often seemed stacked against them. For 8 years, Crockett worked in understaffed, underfunded public defender offices across Missouri and Texas. She handled caseloads that were far beyond what any attorney could reasonably manage, often representing more than 100 active clients at any given time. This experience gave her an intimate understanding of America's criminal justice system that went far beyond academic study or policy analysis. During those years, Crockett represented over 1,500 clients facing everything from minor drug possession charges to serious felonies. She learned to navigate a system where poverty often determined outcomes more than guilt or innocence. She watched prosecutors offer plea deals that her clients couldn't afford to reject, even when they maintained their innocence, because the risk of going to trial without adequate resources was too great. She saw how racial bias influenced every stage of the criminal justice process, from initial police stops to sentencing decisions. She witnessed judges who seemed more interested in clearing their dockets than ensuring justice, and she encountered police officers whose testimony she knew was false but couldn't effectively challenge because she lacked the time and resources for thorough investigation. These experiences had shaped Crockett's understanding of criminal justice reform in ways that no amount of academic study or policy briefings could match. When she talked about the need for comprehensive reform, she wasn't speaking from theoretical knowledge, but from having lived through the system's failures on a daily basis for nearly a decade. Her transition from public defense to electoral politics had been motivated by frustration with the limitations of individual representation. She realized that no matter how effectively she represented her clients, the fundamental problems with the system would continue to destroy lives until someone changed the policies and structures that created those problems in the first place. Crockett's experience in the Texas legislature had further developed her understanding of how to translate real-world problems into effective policy solutions. She had successfully passed criminal justice reform legislation that reduced recidivism rates while maintaining public safety, demonstrating that her approach wasn't just idealistic, but practically effective. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond the personal relationship between Obama and Crockett. For the Democratic Party, this moment represented a broader tension between different approaches to progressive politics. Should the party focus on incremental progress that could attract moderate voters and maintain electoral viability? Or should it pursue bold reforms that addressed urgent social problems even at the cost of political risk? For Crockett personally, Obama's public questioning of her experience and qualifications could have devastating consequences for her political career. As a relatively new member of Congress, she depended on the respect and support of party leadership to advance her legislative priorities and build the coalitions necessary for effective governance. If Obama's criticism gained traction among other Democratic leaders, it could marginalize her within her own party and undermine her ability to advocate for the communities she represented. The room full of Democratic leaders watching this exchange represented the jury that would ultimately judge not just this specific disagreement, but the broader question of what types of experience and expertise the party should value in its rising leaders. Their reaction to this confrontation would signal whether the Democratic Party was ready to embrace leaders whose credentials came from direct service to affected communities, or whether it would continue to prioritize traditional political experience above all other qualifications. As Obama prepared to elaborate on his critique of Crockett's proposals, he had no idea that he was about to encounter someone whose understanding of these issues was both deeper and more practically grounded than his own. The confrontation that was about to unfold would challenge not just Crockett's political future, but Obama's own assumptions about experience, expertise, and the qualifications necessary for effective political leadership. Obama leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but not unkind, preparing to deliver what he believed would be a masterclass in political wisdom. The room remained silent, other attendees sensing the growing tension between two strong personalities who represented different generations and approaches to democratic politics. Representative Crockett, Obama began, using his characteristic pause for emphasis. I've been listening to your presentation, and while I certainly admire your passion for these issues, I have serious concerns about the approach you're suggesting. His tone carried the weight of someone who had spent 8 years in the Oval Office dealing with the complexities of governance that most politicians never fully understand. He gestured toward the policy documents Crockett had distributed to the group, each one representing months of careful research and consultation with experts, advocates, and affected communities. These proposals for criminal justice reform, while undoubtedly well-intentioned, seem to ignore the political realities we face in this country. You're talking about sweeping changes that would require massive political capital and face enormous opposition from Republicans, law enforcement organizations, and even some moderate Democrats. The room remained silent, but Obama could see several attendees nodding slightly at his words, clearly agreeing with his assessment. Senator Joe Manchin shifted in his seat, his body language suggesting approval of Obama's more cautious approach. Several senior congressmen who had spent decades navigating the complexities of federal legislation looked relieved that someone was finally addressing what they saw as the unrealistic ambitions of younger progressives. Obama continued, his voice taking on the professorial tone that had made him such an effective communicator during his presidency. "I've been in this game for a long time, Representative Crockett. I've seen what works and what doesn't in American politics. I've watched passionate advocates crash and burn because they didn't understand how to build sustainable coalitions or navigate the institutional constraints that limit what's possible in our system of government." He paused again, letting his words sink in while studying Crockett's expression. She remained standing, her posture straight and confident, but Obama thought he detected signs of the defensive reaction he expected from politicians who were being challenged by someone with superior experience and wisdom. "What I'm seeing in your presentation," Obama said, his criticism becoming more pointed, "suggests someone who hasn't yet learned how to work within the system to achieve real, lasting change. The ideas themselves may have merit, but the approach shows a lack of understanding about how to actually implement complex policy reforms in a democracy where power is distributed among multiple institutions and competing interests." The atmosphere in the room was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as other attendees realized they were witnessing a significant confrontation between two prominent figures in their party. Some looked down at their phones or papers, uncomfortable with the direct nature of Obama's criticism. Others watched with fascination, knowing they were seeing a moment that could reshape relationships within the Democratic leadership. Obama's criticism became even more direct as he warmed to his theme. "The question I have, Representative Crockett, is fundamentally about experience and judgment. You've been in Congress for less than 2 years. Before that, you served in the Texas legislature, which is certainly valuable experience, but state politics operates on an entirely different level from federal governance." He stood up now, using his full physical presence to emphasize his points. At 6 feet 1 inch, Obama commanded attention in any room, and his movements were calculated to reinforce his authority as he delivered this critique. "The issues you're addressing, criminal justice reform, voting rights, economic inequality, these are incredibly complex problems that have stumped politicians, policy experts, and social scientists for decades. They require not just passion and good intentions, but deep understanding of how to build coalitions, how to compromise when necessary, and how to achieve incremental progress rather than pursuing idealistic goals that will never become reality." Crockett remained silent throughout this extended criticism, but those who knew her well could see the fire building in her eyes. Her hands were clasped behind her back in a posture that suggested controlled tension rather than submission. She had heard variations of this criticism throughout her career, always couched in terms of helpful guidance, but consistently undermining her credibility and expertise. Obama pressed his advantage, confident that his superior experience and political wisdom were having the desired effect. "I'm also deeply concerned about your judgment on some of these specific issues, Representative Crockett. Take your position on law enforcement reform, for example. You're calling for what amounts to a complete overhaul of how we approach public safety in this country. That kind of radical change doesn't just risk political backlash that could set back the progressive cause for years. It risks real harm to communities if implemented poorly or too quickly." He looked around the room, appealing to the other attendees and drawing them into his critique. "We've all learned, sometimes the hard way, that good intentions aren't enough in politics. You need experience to understand the unintended consequences of policy changes. You need to have seen how things can go wrong when you move too fast or push too hard without building proper consensus and support." Several older members of Congress nodded in agreement, their own experiences confirming Obama's warnings about the dangers of ambitious reform efforts that lacked proper political foundation. They had all seen promising initiatives fail because their sponsors hadn't done the careful groundwork necessary for sustainable change. What made Obama's criticism particularly stinging was the condescending tone that crept into his delivery. While he maintained his characteristic calm demeanor, there was an unmistakable air of superiority in his words. He spoke to Crockett as if she were a graduate student presenting a thesis to a dissertation committee rather than a fellow elected official with her own expertise and accomplishments. I think what you need to understand, Jasmine, Obama said, using her first name in a way that emphasized their different status levels within the party hierarchy, is that real change in this country happens slowly and deliberately. It happens through careful building of consensus, through compromise, through understanding that politics is fundamentally the art of the possible rather than the pursuit of the perfect. He gestured expansively, his movements designed to reinforce his role as the senior statesman educating a junior colleague. When I was president, I learned that even with all the power of that office, you can't just will change into existence through force of personality or passionate advocacy. You have to work within the constraints of the system, build relationships across the aisle, accept incremental progress rather than holding out for perfect solutions that may never come. Obama's voice took on an almost paternal quality as he continued his critique. I understand the frustration that drives your approach. I felt the same way when I was younger, when I first entered politics with grand ambitions for transforming American society. But experience teaches you that sustainable change requires patience, strategic thinking, and acceptance of political realities that may not align with your idealistic preferences. Throughout this extended monologue, Crockett remained silent, but her body language was telling a different story. Her jaw was set, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of controlled tension. She had come to this retreat excited to share her ideas and learn from party leaders, but instead found herself being lectured like a child who had disappointed her teacher. The other attendees were watching this exchange with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. They could see that something significant was building, that this was developing into more than just a policy disagreement. The tension between the former president and the young congresswoman was becoming palpable, and everyone in the room sensed that they were witnessing a moment that could have lasting consequences for both individuals and for the party as a whole. Obama delivered his final comment with the confidence of someone who believed he had thoroughly and definitively made his point. What I'm questioning, Representative Crockett, is whether you have the experience and judgment necessary to lead on these complex issues. I think you'd benefit from spending more time learning how the system works, understanding how successful change actually happens, before trying to tear down existing institutions and rebuild them according to your personal vision of what they should look like. The room fell completely silent as Obama's words hung in the air. He had essentially dismissed Crockett's entire political career and policy expertise in front of the Democratic Party's most influential leaders. It was a devastating critique that would normally leave a younger politician scrambling to defend themselves or backing down from their positions in the face of such overwhelming authority. But as the silence stretched on and all eyes turned to Crockett, it became clear that she wasn't going to respond the way Obama expected. Instead of the defensive stammering or apologetic backing down that typically followed such comprehensive criticism, Crockett took a slow, deep breath and stepped forward. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and absolutely deadly in its precision. The confrontation was about to take a turn that no one in the room, least of all Barack Obama, could have predicted. Jasmine Crockett took a slow, deep breath, the kind of pause that trial lawyers use before delivering their most devastating cross-examination question. The room was so quiet that the only sound was the distant hum of air conditioning and the barely perceptible rustle of expensive fabric as attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire career, even if she hadn't known it until now. Mr. President, she began, using his formal title deliberately to establish the proper respect, while also maintaining her own dignity, I genuinely appreciate your perspective on experience and how our political system works. I really do. But I think there's something crucial you're missing in your analysis of my background and qualifications. She took a step forward, her movement calculated to command the room's attention without appearing aggressive or disrespectful. Every person present was now focused entirely on her, waiting to see how she would respond to what many considered a masterful dismantling of her credibility by the most respected political figure in their party. You mentioned my relatively brief time in Congress and my service in the Texas legislature. That's accurate, and I don't dispute those facts. But what you didn't mention, what you apparently haven't taken the time to understand, is what I was doing for the 8 years before I ever ran for political office. Obama shifted slightly in his chair, his supreme confidence beginning to waver, as he sensed something unexpected coming. The dismissive expression on his face was slowly being replaced by genuine curiosity, though he still believed his superior experience and political wisdom would ultimately carry the day. Crockett's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath that became more apparent with each word. For 8 years before I ran for office, I worked as a public defender, not in some comfortable white-collar criminal practice representing wealthy clients who could afford private attorneys, but in the trenches of our criminal justice system, representing the poorest and most vulnerable defendants in cases where their freedom and sometimes their lives were at stake. The room's atmosphere began to shift as attendees realized they were about to hear something that would fundamentally change their understanding of this confrontation. Even Obama was now listening intently, his dismissive posture giving way to focused attention. During those 8 years, I represented over 1,500 clients facing criminal charges. I spent countless hours in county jails, interviewing people who had been arrested for everything from minor drug possession to serious violent felonies. I watched innocent people plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit because they couldn't afford to fight charges against them. I witnessed firsthand how poverty, race, and class determined justice outcomes far more than guilt or innocence. Crockett's voice grew stronger as she continued, her confidence building with each revelation. You want to know about experience, Mr. President? Let me tell you about Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 young children whom I represented when she was facing 10 years in federal prison for allegedly participating in a drug conspiracy. The only evidence against her was the testimony of a paid government informant with a documented history of lying to police officers and prosecutors to reduce his own sentences. The room was completely silent now, every person hanging on her words as she painted a picture of America's criminal justice system that was far removed from the theoretical policy discussions that typically occupied their time. Maria worked 2 minimum-wage jobs to support her family. She had no money for a private investigator, no resources to conduct the kind of thorough investigation that might have proven her innocence. The prosecutor offered her a plea deal. Plead guilty to a lesser charge and serve 18 months, or go to trial and risk 10 years if convicted. What would you have advised her to do, Mr. President? What would your political experience have told her about navigating that choice? Obama opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. Her momentum was building, and she could see that her words were having exactly the effect she intended on everyone in the room. I'll save you the trouble of answering because I know what happened. Maria took the plea deal, even though she maintained her innocence to me throughout the entire process. She served 18 months in federal prison, lost both her jobs, lost her apartment, and had her children placed in foster care. When she was released, she was branded as a convicted felon, making it nearly impossible to find housing or employment. Her family was destroyed by a system that you're asking me to work within and accept as fundamentally sound. The power dynamics in the room had completely shifted. Obama was no longer the confident senior statesman educating a junior colleague. He was beginning to look like someone who was realizing he had badly underestimated his opponent. Crockett continued her systematic demolition of Obama's critique. You talk about experience and understanding how the system works, Mr. President. Well, I understand exactly how it works. I've seen it destroy thousands of lives, not through malicious intent, but through institutional indifference to justice. And while I was learning these lessons in courtrooms and jails across Texas and Missouri, where were you? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Obama's eyes widened slightly as he began to understand where this was headed. You were president for 8 years, Mr. President. 8 years when you had more power to address criminal justice issues than any other person in America. You had the platform, the influence, the political capital, and the constitutional authority to pursue the kind of comprehensive reforms I'm proposing today. So tell me, what sweeping criminal justice reforms did you implement during your time in office? Obama started to respond, but Crockett held up her hand in a gesture that was respectful, but firm. I'll save you the trouble of answering that question too, because I know your record. You passed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences. That was important, but it was incremental. You commuted the sentences of over 1,700 individuals, which was meaningful for those families, but it was limited in scope. You gave speeches about criminal justice reform. You appointed task forces to study the problems, but the fundamental structural issues that I witnessed every day in that courtroom remained exactly the same when you left office as when you entered it. The room was absolutely silent. Several attendees were leaning forward in their chairs, completely absorbed by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. It was a fundamental challenge to assumptions about experience, authority, and expertise that had shaped their understanding of political leadership. Crockett took another step forward, her confidence now fully evident. So, when you question my experience, Mr. President, I have to ask you, what experience do you have with the day-to-day reality of our broken criminal justice system? Have you ever had to tell a mother that her innocent son should plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit because our system won't give him a fair trial? Have you ever watched someone go to prison because they couldn't afford competent legal representation? Have you ever seen how a criminal conviction destroys not just the defendant but entire families and communities? Obama was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and looking around the room as if seeking support from other attendees. But everyone was focused entirely on Crockett, mesmerized by her systematic dismantling of his criticism. You talked about understanding how the system works and the need to build coalitions and compromise. Well, Mr. President, I understand exactly how the system works. It works to perpetuate inequality and injustice. And your incremental approach, your emphasis on compromise and working within existing structures, that's not pragmatic wisdom. That's comfort with a status quo that destroys lives while you debate the politics of change. But Crockett wasn't finished demonstrating the depth of her expertise. You mentioned that these issues are complex and have stumped policy experts for decades. Let me show you just how thoroughly I understand these complexities. She launched into a detailed explanation of her criminal justice reform proposals that demonstrated not just passion and good intentions, but the kind of deep technical knowledge that comes from years of practical experience combined with serious policy study. My sentencing reform proposal isn't some naive call to release everyone from prison or eliminate accountability for criminal behavior. It's a carefully crafted plan that addresses mandatory minimums for non-violent offenses while maintaining strong penalties for violent crimes. It includes provisions for enhanced judicial discretion, evidence-based alternatives to incarceration, robust victim services, and comprehensive re-entry programs designed to reduce recidivism. Obama found himself leaning forward, genuinely impressed. Despite himself by the sophistication of her policy knowledge, this wasn't the idealistic rambling he had expected from a young politician who was in over her head. My police accountability measures aren't anti-law enforcement rhetoric designed to appeal to progressive activists. They're pro-good policing. Reforms developed in consultation with law enforcement professionals who understand that accountability makes everyone safer. They include enhanced training requirements, community oversight mechanisms with real authority, and financial incentives for departments that demonstrate measurable improvements in community relations and public safety outcomes. Crockett pulled out her phone and referenced specific statistics with the confidence of someone who had lived with these numbers for years. The pilot programs I helped design and implement in Texas reduced recidivism rates by 23%, while maintaining public safety and actually improving community police relations. The cost savings from reduced incarceration funded expanded victim services and crime prevention programs. These aren't theoretical ideas that sound good in academic papers, Mr. President. They're proven solutions based on real-world experience and measurable results. She then addressed Obama's criticism about her ability to build coalitions and work across political divisions. You questioned my ability to build consensus and work within our political system. Let me tell you about the coalition I assembled to pass criminal justice reform in Texas, a state that's not exactly known for progressive politics. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had actually done the hard work she was describing, rather than just talking about it in theoretical terms. I worked with conservative Republicans who cared about fiscal responsibility and understood that our current system was wasting taxpayer money while failing to improve public safety. I partnered with law enforcement officers who wanted better training, adequate resources, and community support for their dangerous work. I collaborated with business leaders who understood that mass incarceration was costing the economy billions of dollars while creating barriers to employment and economic growth. Obama's expression had completely changed. The dismissive condescension was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine surprise and growing respect. He was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated not just Crockett's background, but her political skills and policy expertise. That legislation passed the Texas legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support, because I didn't just rely on progressive talking points or idealistic appeals to justice. I did the hard work of understanding different perspectives, identifying common ground, and building relationships with people who initially disagreed with my approach. That's not naive idealism, Mr. President. That's practical politics informed by real-world experience. Crockett's final thrust was the most powerful and personal. You want to know the fundamental difference between your experience and mine, Mr. President? You learned about these issues from briefing books written by staff members, from policy advisors who had studied the problems academically, from statistics compiled by researchers who had never set foot in a county jail or a public defender's office. Her voice carried the weight of moral authority now, the credibility that comes from having lived through the problem she was trying to solve. I learned about these issues from sitting across the table from people whose lives were being destroyed by the system you're asking me to accept and work within. When you talk about incremental progress and the need to compromise with existing power structures, you're talking about accepting that Maria Santos and thousands of people like her will continue to suffer while we wait for the perfect political moment to act. She looked directly at Obama, her gaze steady and unwavering. My experience taught me that for people like Maria, for the families torn apart by our broken system, for the communities devastated by mass incarceration, there is no acceptable timeline for justice. Every day we delay meaningful reform because it's not politically convenient as another day someone innocent sits in prison, another family destroyed, another community torn apart by policies that we know are wrong but lack the courage to change. The room was absolutely silent. Obama sat back in his chair, clearly stunned by the power and precision of Crockett's response. This wasn't the defensive reaction he had expected from a young politician who was supposed to be intimidated by his superior experience and wisdom. Crockett's final words left everyone in the room speechless. So yes, Mr. President, I do question whether your experience of politics from the comfort of high office, insulated from the daily consequences of the policies you're discussing, gives you the perspective necessary to understand the urgency these issues demand. And I respectfully suggest that maybe it's time for those of us with different kinds of experience with the actual problems we're trying to solve, to lead on the issues we understand best. Obama stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly racing as he processed what had just happened. The young congresswoman he had dismissed as inexperienced and naive had just systematically dismantled his critique while demonstrating a depth of knowledge and practical experience that rivaled anyone in the room. Finally, Obama spoke, his voice quiet and thoughtful. Representative Crockett, I think I may have seriously misjudged your background and qualifications. Your point about different types of experience is not just well taken, it's profound. I owe you an apology. The silence that followed Obama's concession stretched for what felt like an eternity. The other Democratic leaders in the room looked back and forth between the former president and Crockett, trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a policy disagreement that had been resolved through respectful debate. It was a complete reversal of power dynamics that no one had anticipated when they arrived at this exclusive retreat. Senator Elizabeth Warren was the first to break the uncomfortable silence, leaning forward with obvious admiration in her voice. Jasmine, that was absolutely incredible. I've been working on criminal justice issues for years, but I've never heard anyone articulate the human cost of our failed system with quite that level of detail and personal authority. Your experience as a public defender gives you insights that those of us who came to these issues through academia or policy work simply don't have. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries nodded enthusiastically in agreement. The coalition-building work you described in Texas is exactly the kind of practical political experience we need more of in Washington. I have to admit, I didn't fully understand your background before this conversation. What you've accomplished shows real political skill, not just passion for the issues. Other attendees began chiming in with their own expressions of surprise and newfound respect. A senior senator from California admitted that she had made similar assumptions about Crockett's qualifications based on her age and relatively recent arrival in Congress. I think we all learned something important today about not making assumptions about people's experience based on traditional political credentials, she said. Obama himself seemed to be undergoing a genuine recalculation of his entire assessment of Crockett and her qualifications. Representative Crockett, I owe you more than just an apology. I made fundamental assumptions about your experience and expertise without taking the time to understand your actual background. What you've just described is exactly the kind of hands-on, practical expertise that our policy discussions too often lack. He paused, clearly still processing the implications of what had just occurred. Your point about different types of experience is something I need to think about seriously. I spent so much time in executive offices and legislative chambers during my political career that I may have lost touch with the ground-level reality of the issues we discuss in these settings. During a brief break in the proceedings, Obama approached Crockett privately, and their conversation was observed by several attendees who later described it as remarkably humble and reflective for someone of Obama's stature. Jasmine, he was heard saying, I was completely wrong to question your experience the way I did. What you said about different types of experience really challenged my assumptions in ways I didn't expect. I think I could learn a great deal from your perspective on these issues. Crockett's response was gracious but firm, reflecting the same confidence she had displayed during their public confrontation. Mr. President, I appreciate that acknowledgement, but I hope you understand why your initial reaction was so frustrating. For me, as a black woman in politics, I constantly have to prove my qualifications in ways that others don't. When someone with your stature and influence questions my experience publicly, it carries enormous weight and can have real consequences for my effectiveness as a legislator. Obama nodded thoughtfully, clearly taking her point to heart. You're absolutely right about that, and I should have been more aware of how my words would be received. I've had the privilege of having my expertise assumed rather than questioned throughout most of my career. That's not something I've thought about deeply enough. Word of the confrontation began spreading through Democratic circles even before the retreat officially ended. Text messages flew between congressional staff members, party operatives, and political journalists who had sources at the gathering. The general narrative remained consistent across all the accounts. Jasmine Crockett had not only stood up to Barack Obama's criticism, but had fundamentally changed his perspective on her qualifications and expertise. Did you hear what happened? At the leadership retreat, Crockett completely dismantled Obama's critique of her experience. She had statistics, specific cases, detailed policy knowledge, coalition-building examples, the whole package. Obama actually apologized to her afterward. I heard he was genuinely impressed by her background as a public defender. When's the last time you saw Obama back down from a position like that? She must have made one hell of an argument. The story took on additional significance as it spread because it represented something larger than just a single confrontation between two politicians. It symbolized a generational and philosophical shift within the Democratic Party about what types of experience should be valued in political leadership. Within 48 hours, carefully sourced accounts of the exchange had reached major political reporters, though the specific details varied depending on the source and their relationship. To the participants, the core elements remained consistent. Obama had questioned Crockett's experience and qualifications. She had responded with a detailed account of her background that revealed expertise he hadn't known about, and he had ultimately acknowledged that his initial assessment had been wrong. Progressive political commentators seized on the story as evidence of a changing of the guard within Democratic politics. This is what it looks like when someone with actual lived experience in the communities affected by our policies challenges the conventional wisdom of establishment politics, wrote one influential blogger. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She exposed the limitations of traditional political experience when it comes to understanding complex social issues. Conservative commentators, while disagreeing with Crockett's progressive politics, found themselves grudgingly admiring her. Performance in the confrontation. You have to respect someone who can hold their ground against Obama like that, regardless of your opinion on her policy positions. That takes real backbone and impressive command of the issues. The aftermath of the confrontation extended far beyond media coverage and political commentary. In Congress, Crockett found herself with dramatically enhanced credibility and respect from colleagues who had heard detailed accounts of her exchange with Obama. Committee chairs who had previously dismissed her as too junior or idealistic began actively seeking her input on criminal justice legislation. After what happened with Obama, nobody questions Jasmine's expertise on these issues anymore, explained one senior Democratic aide who requested anonymity. She proved that she has both the practical experience and the political skills to be a major player in these policy discussions. Committee chairs are calling her office asking for meetings. Republican members of Congress, while still fundamentally disagreeing with her progressive policy positions, began taking her more seriously as a formidable political opponent. She clearly knows her stuff, admitted one Republican committee member. We can't just dismiss her arguments as naive anymore. We have to engage with them substantively, which makes our job harder, but probably makes for better policy overall. Obama's own evolution in the weeks following the confrontation became a subject of intense interest among political observers. In a speech at a prominent law school 3 weeks later, he made specific reference to the importance of understanding policy issues from the perspective of practitioners who work directly with affected communities. I've recently been reminded that there are many different types of experience that are equally valuable in policymaking, he said, in what many interpreted as a direct reference to his exchange with Crockett. Sometimes the most important expertise comes from those working directly with the communities most affected by our policies, rather than from those of us who have primarily experienced these issues from positions of governmental authority. The confrontation had lasting effects on how the Democratic Party approached questions of experience and qualification for leadership roles. Younger members of Congress began explicitly citing Crockett's example when their own credentials were questioned, based on their age or non-traditional backgrounds. Look at what Jasmine Crockett brought to the criminal justice discussion. 8 years as a public defender gave her insights and expertise that decades of traditional political experience couldn't match, became a common refrain among progressive politicians defending their own qualifications. Party leadership began re-evaluating how they assessed the qualifications of potential candidates and rising leaders. The assumption that traditional political experience was automatically superior to other forms of professional background was now openly questioned within Democratic circles. The Crockett moment, as it became known among party insiders, represented a broader recognition that effective policymaking required input from people who had direct experience with the problems being addressed, not just from those who had studied them academically or approached them from positions of political authority. For Crockett personally, the confrontation marked a decisive turning point in her national political career. She had proven to herself and others that she could stand up to the most respected figures in her party when she believed her expertise and perspective were being unfairly dismissed. That moment taught me to trust my experience and not be intimidated by traditional authority structures, she reflected months later in an interview. I had spent years questioning whether I really belonged in those rooms with senior politicians, but that day I realized my experience was just as valuable as anyone else's, maybe more valuable for certain issues. Her relationship with Obama evolved into one of genuine mutual respect and collaboration. They began consulting regularly on criminal justice issues, with Obama frequently deferring to her expertise on matters related to public defense, sentencing, reform, and the practical implementation of justice system changes. Barack has become someone I can call when I need advice on political strategy, Crockett said. And he calls me when he wants to understand how policy changes will actually affect the communities I used to represent as a public defender. It's become a really productive relationship. The confrontation also became part of a larger conversation within the Democratic Party about the value of diverse types of experience in political leadership. The party began actively recruiting candidates with backgrounds in public service, professions, teachers, social workers, public defenders, community organizers, healthcare workers, rather than focusing exclusively on traditional political resumes. The Crockett-Obama exchange showed us that we need leaders who understand the problems we're trying to solve from the ground up, not just from the top down, explained a senior party strategist. We're looking for people who have lived with these issues in their professional lives, not just studied them or managed them from governmental positions. Beyond Democratic Party politics, the confrontation resonated with voters across the political spectrum who were frustrated with traditional politicians making decisions about issues they had never personally experienced. Polling showed that voters responded positively to politicians who could demonstrate practical experience in the areas they were trying to reform. Crockett's story became a template for how elected officials could establish credibility by connecting their professional backgrounds directly to their policy positions. Other politicians with non-traditional backgrounds began emphasizing their practical experience more prominently in their public communications. The lasting message of the confrontation extended beyond politics to anyone who had ever been dismissed as too young, inexperienced, or unqualified. Crockett's response to Obama provided a masterclass in how to defend your credentials while remaining respectful but firm in the face of criticism from authority figures. The exchange proved that different types of experience bring different types of wisdom to complex problems, and that sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from those closest to the issues being discussed. It demonstrated that having the courage to speak truth to power, when backed by real knowledge and experience, could change minds and shift entire political conversations. Most importantly, it showed that even the most respected authorities could be wrong in their assessments, and that challenging those assessments respectfully but firmly could lead to better understanding and more effective solutions to complex problems. The story became required reading in political science courses as an example of how expertise and authority intersect in American politics. It illustrated the importance of understanding where knowledge comes from and recognizing that practical experience can be just as valuable as theoretical understanding or traditional credentials. For anyone watching American politics, the confrontation between Obama and Crockett represented a pivotal moment in how the country thinks about qualification, experience, and the types of leaders needed to address complex social challenges. It proved that democracy works best when different types of expertise are valued, and when people have the courage to challenge assumptions about who is qualified to lead. If this story of political courage and the power of standing up for your expertise inspired you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most compelling political moments that reveal the real dynamics shaping American democracy. What do you think about Crockett's response to Obama's initial criticism? Do you believe different types of professional experience should be valued equally in political leadership? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories of political courage and the moments that define our democracy.